A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing is secret that will not become known. What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone, therefore, who acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Mark looked down at his wedding ring on the Formica table, sitting next to a cold cup of coffee in a cheap diner. He remembered as he looked at that ring the first time that he had ever met Mindy. He was, of course, at a bar, and he had, of course, had too much to drink, and he was crawling around on the floor underneath the table looking for his keys, and Mindy saw him and found him, realized he could not drive, got him home, helped him up the stairs, even turned on the coffee maker so that the next morning he would have coffee to wake up from the hangover he would have on the way to work. It was like that throughout most of their relationship, actually. Mindy had always reached out to him, taken care of him, done exactly what he needed. It was amazing the way that she could take care of him. She knew exactly which bar he was going to be at. She knew exactly when he would be completely out of control and needed somebody to come rescue him. She knew what he needed and took care of him until he hit rock bottom. And he did some things he was not proud of. And he realized he had to change. And he did. He completely remade his life. He started going to AA meetings and found the best sponsor that would fit for him perfectly. And was sober for 18 months. He brought the coin home to give to Mindy. And instead, she gave him the divorce papers. I don't even know who you are anymore. I just can't do this, she said. So now, as he stared at the ring on the Formica table across from that cold cup of coffee, sat his sponsor, who told him there's a saying in AA, Mark. Sobriety wrecks families. When a family has an alcoholic, needs an alcoholic to survive, they don't know what to do when you get clean. Mindy needed to be your rescuer. She needed to be your savior. And now that she can't be, she doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know how she fits into your life. Sobriety is exactly what you need. But it can look like violence to the family system that you once had. Joan was finally ready to take the plunge, literally. She had been going to the church for several months, and she knew today was the day. This was the time. She came forward and said, I want to be baptized. And her entire church family celebrated with her, and all of her brothers and sisters, when they heard the news, celebrated with her, and her friends were ecstatic for her. She knew this was the time and knew this was the way that she could share with others the way that God had changed her life. Now she had to tell Dad. And so she went to see Mom and Dad and tell them the good news. Tell them that she'd love it if they would come. She was terrified. You see, Dad had always been, at least since he was a young child, a staunch atheist. He had believed that church and Christians were nuts. Joan could remember when she was a child, and he would drive past churches on Sunday morning, and he would just release this rant of curse words about how stupid those people were. They're wasting their money, they're wasting their time, they're wasting their lives. And so it took Joan until she was almost 30 before she would even step into the doors of a church. Her father had been raised in a very strict, almost abusive, fundamentalist Christian home. And so what he saw and what he believed happened behind those doors was completely different than what Joan experienced in her church community. And she wanted to tell him that. She wanted to explain that to him, but he just wouldn't listen. And she sat there in tears, trying to explain to Mom and Dad this new life, to say, this is who I am now. Dad opened the door and said, well, you are not one of us anymore. Powerful stories, difficult stories. Stories that speak to the difficulty and complicated life that we live in family. But it's a part of the ways that we understand what God does in our lives. And Mark's story may not be your story, and Joan's story may not be your story, but there's a part of it, there's a piece of it that's just like what each and every one of us has to do. Perhaps you know of a word that I've talked about, a phrase that I've talked about before called self-differentiation. I want to talk about that some this morning because I think it helps us understand the passage that we read earlier and to understand what it is that we do in our lives. Differentiation is the process that we go through of saying, this is who I am. Separate from what you want me to be, separate from what my family wants me to be, separate from what the people in my life want me to be. This is who I am, differentiated from your thoughts and expectations. And we do it throughout life. The very first time that the child says no in the grocery store checkout line, differentiation. The very first time that the elementary school student realizes that Mom isn't all she's cracked up to be. She's not the perfect hero that she once thought. Differentiation. That moment when the teenager roars away from the driveway for the first time with a license in his pocket. Differentiation. That moment when the college student sleeps in the dorm room for the first time without Mom or Dad or anybody else. Differentiation. A moment when Dad walks the daughter down the aisle and gives her a kiss on the cheek. Differentiation. It's a process that we go through. It's a process that never really completely ends. To differentiate from our families of origin. Of course, we all come from some family, however you define it, but yet we are required in our life of maturity to separate from that. The problem is we often do it really badly. We're not really often that good at it. Experts in family systems theory, such as Edwin Freeman or Murray Bowen, we'll talk about the fact that oftentimes what we do is we fail to self-differentiate. And in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes pretty subtle, we continued to be connected. We continued to be kind of drug into that family system that we were born with. Just like Mark was. Continuing to be drug into the relationship, an unhealthy one with Mindy, just like Joan was. And so these experts will talk about the ways that we tend to do this badly. He says there's two examples, two ways that we tend to do it badly. The first one is a process called enmeshment. Enmeshment is when we need that other person to tell us who we are. We need that other person to kind of continue to be the voice in our lives. Of course, the cliche, the easy example is the 40-year-old who still has mom do his laundry, or the daughter who's grown up and has 3 kids of her own but still calls dad 4 or 5 times a day just to check in and make sure that she's doing everything right. These aren't healthy, we can see this, but it could be more subtle than that. Think of Jason's story. Jason got a new job, and he was so excited, and he told everybody about it. He went out and bought new suits, and everybody at his old job said, well, this is a step up, and I'm glad you're able to move away. I'm glad you're able to do those things. And of course, his wife was thrilled for him, and everybody that he knew, and his brothers and sisters. And then he went to tell mom and dad, and he went and took them out to eat and said, I'll pay for the steak dinner because I have some good news. And of course, Dad slapped him on the back as soon as he told him the good news. And Dad was excited for him. And then they looked at Mom. And Mom didn't smile. And Mom didn't say a word. Mom just raised an eyebrow. And Jason was done for the night. He hardly said another word. He paid for the meal and slept away. And the next morning he called his new employer and said, I can't take the job. Mom was still telling him who he was supposed to be. She didn't even need to say a word. That subtle enmeshment with the people that surround us. And it doesn't just have to be a parent. It could be anybody in our lives. It could be a coworker. It could be a neighbor. It could be a sibling. It could be a spouse. When their absence is required for us to know who we are, that is not a differentiated self. That is enmeshment. But there's another way that we tend to do this poorly, and that is the process of cutoff. So on one hand, some people define themselves by this presence with another individual. Sometimes they define it by the absence. And the cliche is, instead of calling mom or dad 10 times a day, I haven't talked to them in a decade. They're cut off, they're cut out. I won't respond to their calls. I won't go see them at Christmas. I don't want to spend a minute in the room with them. It's cut off. And again, it could be more subtle than that. Recognizing that instead of defining yourselves by their presence, you're defining themselves by their absence. They are the foil against which you argue. They are the ones that they must be the enemy in your life. And again, it could be family, it could be friends, it could be anyone in this process of emotional cutoff. But you are still just as tied to them when you are cut off as if you called them 10 times a day. They are still defining who you are. And in the midst of this, to take a stand and to say, I will not be enmeshed, I will not be cut off, but I will instead be differentiated from that, feels like violence to that system. Clearly, it felt to Mark's wife like violence, to Joan's father like violence to the way things are supposed to be. To take that well-differentiated stand is a difficult thing. But when you do that, it creates this opportunity for you to be what Friedman calls separate yet connected. It gives you the opportunity to not feel like you're reacting to everything. Instead, you can respond as one who is healthy. But it's difficult. It's difficult if you are the dad who's used to getting that phone call 10 times a day. It's difficult if you are the wife who needs to be the rescuer of your husband. And it's difficult if you are the mother who hears your son say, I have no mother. I have no brothers. I have only the will of my Father in heaven. Which is exactly what Jesus said. Again and again we hear this language from Jesus that sounds like that. It sounds like, to be honest, that he's saying family is bad. I have no father or mother, or leave your father. Let the dead bury their own dead. Or he says in the passage today, I have come to set a man against his father. I have come to set a daughter against her mother. I have come to set in-laws against one another. Like he really needed to do that anyway. I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. And to read this makes one wonder, what is Jesus saying? Is family something that is bad? Is family something that is wrong in the life of faith? But I believe if you take this concept of differentiation and lay it over the top of what Jesus is doing here, you'll find what he's doing is not saying family is bad. But what he's doing instead is he is forcing us to ask a question. Who do you follow? Who do you follow? He's telling those that might follow him that if you're really going to do this, this is what it's going to take. It's going to take a differentiation from your family of origin. It's going to take a differentiation from even your spouse or your friends or your family. What it's going to take is for you to separate yet stay connected with them. Who do you follow? It's a question that is haunting to many of us and is sometimes difficult to answer. But it is a question that all those who would call themselves Christ followers would need to ask. Now, as we read this passage, as we read these passages, we find out that when Jesus says something like this, that I've come to bring sword and not peace, my belief is that it feels like that in the midst of some of those family systems. Of course, it felt like that to Mindy, didn't it? That Mark was being violent, even though he was trying to become healthy and strong. Felt like that to Joan's father, that she was ignoring his wishes and ignoring the way that he would have her be. It feels like violence to the system because it is. But here's the deal. Jesus doesn't say that all family is bad. Jesus doesn't say that family should not be. What he says is that there are some who would distract from our call. And when we answer that question, who would you follow, we must answer it recognizing the power of the cross. That just as Jesus left mother and brothers and family to follow the will of his Father, if we are to follow him, sometimes that means we are to take a step away from those who would define for us what our lives are to be about. But there's a power to this. You know, Jesus would not, of course, use this language of differentiation. He wouldn't have talked about being enmeshed or being cut off. But what he does is he talks about being a disciple. He talks about being a follower. He talks about being kingdom people. And of course, I don't believe that he would say that all family is bad. I believe that if we find ourselves following Christ, he would say, of course, family members that encourage that, family members that say, I'm glad this is who you are now, those folks would, of course, be kingdom people as well. What Jesus does here is offer for us a way to follow, a way that I would call being a differentiated disciple. One that understands the power of being able to be separate yet connected. To be differentiated and not either enmeshed or cut off. And there is power in that. There is strength in that. There is freedom in that. There is freedom in being able to say that I don't have to allow another person to tell me how to live my life. That the one I follow is the Christ who knows me best. The one who knows my gifts, the one who created me, the one who understands who I need to be. That is the one I follow. And there is freedom in not being overwrought by others' expectations and others' needs and others' presuppositions. There's also a sense of hope, a sense of anticipation when we become differentiated disciples. We recognize that we don't need to allow those others to tell us this is how you're going to live your life. There's a sense, too, of grace. Recognizing that once you can understand that within yourself, then others then are allowed to follow Christ as they might feel called. How often do we say, well, you're not doing it right. You're not living life the way we should. But if there's a grace to be able to separate from that, then we're able to give freedom to others. There's an independence to that as well. There's an understanding that we don't need to follow those that stand up here on the chancel, or those that teach our Sunday school class, or those that taught us our faith the first time. Instead of following them, we are going to follow Christ. And so, in that independence, there is a new freedom. Recognizing that our lives will get a lot easier if we don't feel obligated to say yes to everybody's request. We will not be nearly as overwrought or overworried if we don't need to take care of everybody else. Jesus is saying, if you follow me, you need to do it in a way that separates from everybody else's needs and focuses on this one thing. And so, it sounds hard, doesn't it? And it is. Friedman says that many of us don't ever get there, and it's a lifelong task if we do. But there's good news. That even in the midst of the hardness, and Jesus says this is hard to do. That's why he connects it to the cross. That this is a difficult process and a difficult way of life. This life of a differentiated disciple. But he also says that there is joy in this life. He also says that there is strength in this life. And so when we choose to live this life, we choose to receive those blessings as well. You see, when we look to this passage, when we look to what Christ is doing, what we see here is an amazing set of words. He says, do not be afraid. Don't be ruled by the fear of having to make everybody else happy, but instead live a life of blessing by God. He says, follow me. And in the following, you will be blessed. As we together continue to be the people of God, we recognize that there is strength in one another. That each of us can encourage one another without having to become enmeshed with one another. We recognize there is strength in ourselves, that now all of a sudden we can become stronger disciples, being able to focus on what God has called us to be. And we recognize there is power in the Spirit, that the Spirit acts beside us, beneath us, along with us. We recognize there is power in the gospel, for as we struggle in our lives to be a disciple and to share the disciple life with others and to encourage others to engage in that life, as we live the life of a differentiated disciple, we recognize that the power of the gospel is proclaimed, that even in the midst of the challenge, that even in the midst of the struggle, there is hope. And just like the passage tells us this morning, that when we lose our lives for the sake of Christ, then we find it. This morning I invite you to find your life. Find what it is that Christ has called you to become. Everybody else will give you a version of what they want you to be. But who has God called you to be? Who is the Spirit empowering you to be? As we sing our final hymn, you are invited to come forward and to share that you want to join that journey. That you want to join the journey of finding out who it is that God has made you to be and is making you to be. Perhaps you would join this congregation, or to say for the first time that Christ has touched your heart and changed your heart and you want to follow Him in your life. Whatever your response would be as we sing our final hymn, you are invited to respond.